Hello, I'm Sevda. Today I want to talk about how the narratological term storyworld transfigures into the posthuman multi-storyverse to underline the interrelatedness of the human and other than human worlds. I will discuss the agentic capacity of the non-humans in these worlds in relation to Nick Hayes' The Rime of the Modern Mariner. I will also discuss how the reader recipients cognize and travel to these storyverse in the light of the 4EA cognition. My approach is a response to the need for a shift in the definition of the human as a consequence of the unabated environmental degradation, anthropogenic pollution, and lastly the outbreak and exponential spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. Erin James and Eric Morel claim that understandings of narrative change as the environment changes. Also, Catherine Hales contends that the coronavirus is posthuman in the sense that it denotes the multiplicity of agencies within our ecological niche, and adds that we need a thorough reconceptualization of the concepts and vocabularies with which to describe and analyze the complex interdependencies, as well as the ways in which humans as a species are interdependent with one another as well. The pandemic offers an opportunity to rethink the ways in which we can identify with each other and with life forms radically different from us. Therefore, it's an urgent need for narrative theory to overcome its humanistic and anthropocentric perspective in approaching narratives. Posthuman Multi storyverse is part of this attempt. The underpinning of the posthuman multi storyverse is the notion that narratives are constituted by the myriads of coherent and entangled storyverse. In this multi-storyverse, everything is connected, even the parts that are deemed to be disconnected. More precisely, it is predicated upon the idea that the coexistence of and interactivity among the various entities as a challenge to the anthropocentric assumption of the human as autonomous, independent, and disembodied subject. It therefore calls attention to the co-emergence and affectivity between the human and other than human, challenging the erroneous and delusional belief of separate bodies, minds, and worlds. It attests to the idea that the world is a not in motion and becoming is always becoming bit, in Donna Haraway's words. The alternate storyverse coexist together, emerging through and recognizing the agencies of one another. Consequently, it includes no center by virtue of its rhizomatic characteristics. As in the case of Everett's reinterpretation of Schrödinger's cat experiment and quantum entanglement, these posthuman storyworlds could be projected in an antithetical and divergent way to each other. However, they are not decohered from one another. They are linked to each other in an acentered and non-hierarchical way. In this knotted multi-storyverse, the human is no longer at the origin or center of the universe. Instead, is the result of the entangled agencies in alternative storyverse. Posthuman multi-storyverse thus draws attention to the agentic capacity of other than humans, including the organic and non-organic narrative artifacts in the construction of storyverse by the writers and in the reimagining of these imaginary worlds by the reader recipients. Also, my discussion centers around the cognitive processes of the authors and the reader recipients in the reimagining of posthuman multi-story worlds, on how the other mind forces, namely the body, environment, in other words, the physical features and artifacts, spatio-temporal dynamics such as natural devastations, and pandemics as well, and affective states such as moods, feelings, and attitudes of the authors and of the reader recipients are active during the construction of servers by the writers and of the immersion of the reader recipients into these worlds. For this purpose, I draw on the neuroscientific approach, the 4EA cognition, which is embodied, embedded, enactive, extended, and affective. The embodied mind theory, as the first E in the 4EA cognition, contends that the agency of the body is not peripheral to the mind in cognition because cognition is embodied. Through the idea of the embodied simulation, the theory asserts that the perceivers do not need to perform the actions and emotions of the target because witnessing them is enough to activate the same cortical regions in their brain that will become active if they were executing the same actions. It also postulates that reader recipients simulate and viscerally understand the actions, attitudes, and feelings of the story world inhabitants in narratives. The embodied mind theory named this act the liberated simulation. The theory hence throws a light on the ways that the reader recipients understand and empathize with the imaginary characters, regardless of their being non-human, dishuman, or human. At this point, the embodied mind is closely linked to Suzanne Keen's narrative, empathy. She maintains that empathy does not require a close, concrete contact between the empathizer and the target. Rather, empathy as a vicarious, spontaneous sharing of affect can emerge by witnessing or hearing or even by reading about another's affective states, which is then named as narrative empathy. Reading thus allows the reader to change their agency and centeredness in terms of thought and feeling. The shift in agency and centeredness paves the way for empathizing with other than humans in narratives, because it enables the reader recipients to move away from the self to some extent and to focus on the target. The liberated simulation and subsequent empathic engagement of the reader recipient with story world inhabitants canalize them into the posthuman story world. The embedded cognition, which is the second step towards the 4EA cognition, puts emphasis on the environment in the cognitive processes. In this respect, cognition transpassing the boundaries of the mind and body extends into the environment. Within the scope of the embedded cognition, I'd suggest that while the physical aspects and spatio-temporal dynamics embedded in the actual world accompany the authors in the creation of the story world, the characteristics of both the actual and the imaginary environments of the reader recipients participate and work together in cognizing the story worlds. In particular, the narrative artifacts embedded in narratives carry the potential of affecting and assisting the cognitive and imaginative processes. The reader recipients try to cognize and empathize with the more than human by seeing with these story worlds. Moreover, they as active agents examine the narrative environments, searching for these narrative artifacts to make sense of the world surrounding them, as they do in the actual world, to the extent that narratives allow them. However, when narratives face them with the unknown and unfamiliar words, they have recourse to their imagination, through which they mingle what the narrative environments offer them with what their imagination presents. The next stage is enactivism, which argues that the living body is a self-maintaining and autonomous system, and that cognition results from the dynamic interaction between the organism and its surrounding environment. With the help of enactivism, I concentrate on how reader recipients, during transportation into the unexplored servers, change their environments from the actual to the imaginary environments to initiate their reconstructive thinking. Furthermore, as a result of their immersion, the reader recipients reconstruct their imaginary niches or umwelten, which is non-dualistic, by recognizing the agency of the simplest organism or the non-organic matter. As for the last E of the theory, extended mind, avers that the mind extends into the world and that the internal and external resources, such as the technological resources, integrally take active part in the cognition. David Chalmers, in Supersizing the Mind, paves the way for extending their theory, remarking that it is natural to ask whether the extended mind thesis might itself be extended. What about the extended desires, extended reasoning, extended perception, extended imagination, and extended emotions? As a response, I will talk about how narratives become the extended imagination of the authors and reader recipients. I will deal with this point in relation to the extended mind and affectivity. The last phase in the Fourier cognition is affect, which indicates the intensities that pass from body to body, regardless of being human, non-human. Denotes posthuman concerns with regard to underlying the interdependency among these bodies. On the other hand, affect in affective science refers to the affective states. Affective cognition highlights the parts that affective states play in the cognitive processes. Within this context, I will deal with the tripartite affectivity among the author, narrative, and reader recipients in the reimagining process of the Posthuman Multi storyverse. Recalling Chalmers' suggestion of extending the extended mind, and of Colombetti and Roberts' venture in extending affectivity beyond the skin and skull, I'd suggest that narratives become the extended imagination of the authors during the process of writing and telling, of the reader recipients during their transportation into the posthuman multi-storyverse. There exist two dimensions in the extended imagination that are built upon the tripartite reciprocal relationship among the author, narrative, reader, recipient. In the first level, the affective experience that the writer encounters, regardless of whether in real or imaginary words, is conveyed in narratives. The literary and stylistic characteristics and the content of the narrative affect and are affected by the density of the author's affective states at the moment of writing. In the next level, the reader recipient comes into close contact with the story world that comes into existence through the imagination of the author. The narrative in this dimension is affected by the affective states of the reader recipient in the process of reading. The purposefulness of narrative elements and narratives are exploited and reimagined according to the flow and intensity of the reader recipient's affective states in the reconstruction of story worlds. To put it briefly, Posthuman Multi storyverse projects the entanglement of the human and non-human rather than concentrating on taxonomies. What happens in one of the worlds affects the others as a consequence of the affective interdependency between the human and other than human, and the rhizomatic interconnections. Wheeler maintains that it is the notion of the human that alienates itself in the sense that it implies a false representation on existence, which denies the fact that the human is not self-contained beings defined by a core essence, ideal, consciousness, or body. Hence, following the pathways leading to the posthuman multi-storyverse, the reader recipients become estranged from the anthropocentric definitions of the human that deny the multi-agency inherent in their own bodies. Within this theoretical context, I will deal with Rime of the modern mariner. Nick Hayes reimagines Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner as an eco-hagiographic novel. Under the influence of the image of an albatross whose chest was torn up by the plastic bottle top, the story of Coleridge's Mariner is reworked to give voice to the North Pacific gyre, which has been turned into swaths of polystyrene, bobbed with tons of neoprene and methyl methacrylate stretched across the scene. Tupperware and bottle tops, bottle bleach and tires, the detritus of a careful kind, a scattered funeral pyre. In this sense, the narrative turns into the extended imagination of Hayes. The mutual interplay between Hayes' mind, body, environment, and affective state assists the writer in rebuilding the posthuman multi storyverse of the ancient mariner. In other words, the interchange among these forces in his reimagining process extends into the narrative. The cognitive processes of the author are aided by his embodied, enactive, and affective interaction with his environment, that is, the North Pacific gyre, as a lightless maelstrom, a stifled silence clogged the sky, bereft of seabird song. The ancient mariner affects and is affected by Hayes' affective states about and experience with the North Pacific gyre. As for the relationship between the reader, recipient, and narrative, Kokkonen argues that just they step across a gutter, their minds create connection between the individual panels by drawing inferences about how the action in one can relate to the other, and thereby trying to integrate them into a single meaningful narrative. However, Hayes, instead of speech balloons, mostly utilizes the gutters, the space between the panels. It allows the reader recipient to follow the course of the plot and to relate the panels to each other. Scott McCloud calls this act of making sense between panels closure, which underlines the agency of the reader recipients since they participate in the act of reimagining. Building upon the idea of the closure, I propose that narratives turn into their extended imagination as a result of the coupling of the two. It affects and is affected by their affective states and their affective experience with the narrative. In this respect, it gains an additional functionality, that of an external complementary and integrated artifact, rather than a non-cognitive environmental probe that assists the reader recipients in the recreation of the narrative. In other words, they see through the ancient mariner, keeping some details, and seeing it through the North Pacific gyre. The reader recipients travel into the posthuman multi storyverse by following the graphic artifacts, namely the albatross, the detritus, the Medusa's head of nylon nets. In the storyworld are embodied, embedded, enactive, and affective, cooperating with the reader recipient in the reimagining of storyworld as a result of the affective reciprocity among the two. In this way, the reader recipient sees through the graphic artifacts, or in Clark's verse, the transparent equipment. Graphic artifacts intentionally situated in particular parts in narratives by the author activate and re-energize the imagination of the reader recipients, thereby predisposing them to immerse into the posthuman multi-story world. The albatross, kidneys withered by the sun, were strangled by this mesh. A plastic bag hung around its bones, decomposed like flesh. The didactic gaze of the mariner works in tandem with the graphic agency in order to immerse the reader recipients into the posthuman multi-storyverse. They canalize the reader recipients into these unknown, non-human storyworlds or bodies, especially when their imagination fails to travel. The mariner looks across the sea and notices that they are surrounded by a wash of polity. The didactic gaze of the mariner targets the reader recipients. It predisposes them to reimagine the interrelatedness of the human and other than human worlds and bodies. These worlds and bodies are embedded into each other in panels, in the same way in a splash page. In other words, the graphic details underscore the fact that these putatively separate worlds and bodies are not decoupled from each other. Also, one of the mariners in another splash page pointing at the modern mariner, in fact, directly addressing the reader recipients. Thereby, he predisposes them to become a part of the crime that the mariner commits. The narrative directs them into its story world, and they simulate the mariner's actions and feelings. Also, as reader recipients move from the actual world to the imaginary environment that only narratives allow them to inhabit, they immerse deep into the story world. They utilize the features of the story world through which they intensify their creative capacity. They engulf the story worlds by redefining, transforming, and partly creating their own imaginative niches, both by the way of following narrative artifacts and also by adding to them through the power of their imagination that feeds on their own actual environment. In turn, reader recipients rebuild their actual environment as a consequence of the 4 EAs of cognizing the story world. To conclude, as a graphic narrative, the Rime of the modern mariner calls attention to the graphic agency in empathizing with the non-human world. The narrative depicts the repercussions of the anthropogenic activities of the human and offers a graphic imaginary niche, which is replete with lucid graphic artifacts that are ready for the reader recipients to make use of. They fail to fight against the imaginative resistance thanks to the images coupled with the words. In the narrative, the sequence of the panels, the images and the words cooperate in the projection of the inseparability of the human and other than human birth. Thank you.